It is this framing of social progress towards universal human dignity that undergirds essentially all Western social movements. And these have ultimately emerged from the Christian notion that universal human dignity is the goal to be pursued by a just society.
Hey there YouTube, I'm Forrest, Latter-day Skeptic. Today we're going to be talking about a claim that's been around for a long time. And if you stay around to the end of this video, I'm going to let you in on a juicy secret. The claim that the West was founded on Judeo-Christian ethics has been around for a long time.
Our foundational principles, certainly in Western culture, come from Christianity.
Judeo-Christian values are predicated on the existence of a God of morality. The entire Western world, what we call Western civilization, is based on this understanding.
European and American culture, which is based on Judeo-Christian values, is better than other cultures. I think it's uncontroversial to say so.
That was the basic foundation of America. It was a Judeo-Christian ethic. It was a Judeo-Christian reasoning.
Although this claim has been around for a long time, it's hard to draw a causal relationship between Christian teachings and Western values. And in fact, it's easier to do the opposite.
The best way to succinctly address the primary assertion is to first identify Western values and to then trace back when, where, and why they emerged. And so, let's start with freedom of speech, the very bedrock of a free society, and the right that allows us to enact and defend all other rights. Is this Western value of Judeo-Christian origin? No. Both the Old and New Testament proclaim strict limitations on free speech through primarily blasphemy laws, and until very recently, Jewish and Christian governments declared exactly the same. Hell, the Inquisition is the antithesis of free speech, as they literally incinerated anyone who didn't share their barbaric, unenlightened beliefs. So far as evidence indicates, the principle of free speech and expression dates back 2,500 years to ancient Athens and the Roman Republic. But true freedom of speech didn't emerge until the early Enlightenment, 1689, with first the British Bill of Rights and shortly after the French Revolution, 3,500 years after Judaism and 1,700 years after Christianity.
Stephen Woodford continues to make this analysis for justice and democracy. The reason I'm bringing up this conversation again is that the Mormon apologist channel Thoughtful Faith is claiming that universal human values are a Christian idea that are taken for granted in the Western mind.
Human civilization for thousands of years had a commonality in its brutality and viewing human beings through the class lens, which is the opposite of our modern worldview that recognizes the universal humanity, dignity, and equality of rights that all people are entitled to. So what changed? When Christianity instills the universal dignity of all mankind, it lights a flame of social reformation, in which it frames the idea of social progress toward a society where universal human dignity is fully realized.
In today's video, I'm going to show you that the claim that Christianity made the Western mind is exactly backwards. Most of what we consider Christian culture today is just what remains after Western values have stripped off the most brutal and barbaric teachings in the Bible, leaving a neutered Christianity that takes the form of people like Jordan Peterson.
God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time. God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure.
Before we dive into this claim, I want to highlight a few things off the bat. I recently took a course at school, and one of the assigned readings reminded me of this claim specifically. We fail to appreciate the complexity in systems and instead resort to linear cause and effect thinking. Life around us is incredibly complex, yet we tend to think in linear cause and effect relationships. To claim that the Western mind was made by Christianity seems to be a perfect example of this simplistic cause and effect thinking. Who thinks they can prove a cause and effect relationship all the way from the teachings of Jesus 2,000 years ago to the morality of today?
These ideas create moral tensions that inspire what he calls ripples of revolution.
I think essentially what Paul's significance is that he sets up ripple effects of revolution throughout Western history.
It's hard enough for us to draw conclusions about recent things, like what led to the end of the Cold War 30 years ago, or why companies like Apple succeed while other impressive companies fail, let alone drawing conclusions about a causal chain that's 2,000 years old. While I appreciate that you found an atheist that agrees with your claim, this kind of grandiose statement requires just a little bit of critical thinking in order to see the flawed logic. My first point of contention is that Tom Holland only provides us with a correlative relationship, not a causal relationship.
In almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more. And it was kind of like, I was thinking, well, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch. You get on your back and you can't find it. And I began to realize that actually, in almost every way, I am Christian.
It might be true that Christian societies are less brutal than non-Christian societies, but there's so many complex issues at play here that this seems to me to be linear thinking. And most importantly, Tom is conflating religion with culture. It might be the case that he doesn't relate to those other cultures because they're not his culture. He could just as easily make the claim that he's Christian to the core because he likes to eat burgers and fries or fish and chips or whatever the British eat, and other cultures don't. Ripple effects from the dietary history of the Christian people led Tom Holland to have a Christian diet to his core. It might be true that our culture, which is mostly Christian, believes in universal human values, but that does not mean that we believe in universal human values because we are Christian. Now that I've highlighted that it's not enough to rely on a correlative relationship for evidence, let's see if we can find a causal relationship. Let's dive into the historical text that represents the teachings of Jesus and his apostles.
But compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world.
Well, the Western world, as we take for granted,
concepts of human rights, all these kind of things. Ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul.
Now let's take a look at a few verses that they tend to not mention. A woman should learn to be in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Keep in mind, this is just the New Testament. There's plenty of evil teachings throughout the rest of the Christian canon, especially the Old Testament.
We're back to Moses. Remember the guy who brought us the 10 Commandments? He's teaching the Israelites a few more commandments from God.
And it reads, when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife.
God allowed the Israelites to take captive women as their wives, but of course, only if they're beautiful. Again, I want to emphasize, the Bible is not a moral book. God condones evil throughout the Old and New Testament.
As you can see, there's a huge discrepancy between the Christian Bible and the Christian culture that we see today. If the idea of universal human values comes from the Bible, how is it that we deal with universal human value issues in the Bible? As an analogy, imagine if you had a math book that taught you 2 + 2 = 4 and then later taught you 2 + 2 = 5. How would you be able to decipher which one is true without an external source? It's clear that when we read the Bible, we bring our own external moral framework to it.
This is why the Bible, in my view, can't be the real repository of our moral wisdom in any sense, because when you go to read it, you are forced to ignore certain passages or reinterpret them rather aggressively to conform to what you now in the 21st century have every reason to believe is good or a direction worth going socially. So, it is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible. It's explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New, right? And Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. So,
lastly, let's look at external sources that predate Christianity for universal human values. Perhaps maybe Christianity is influenced by the culture that predated it, just like the rest of history.
Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law.
Cyrus the Great gives us evidence of human rights that predate Jesus by 500 years. And Greece and Rome also had this notion of human rights that predates Christianity.
This natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king.
There was a 1,200-year gap between the time of Jesus and when the Magna Carta was written. Easy to blame this on a ripple effect without showing any real causation. But let's look into the Magna Carta and see why it was signed, and perhaps it was actually signed because of Christian teachings.
King John had imposed heavy taxes on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. If they refused to pay, he punished them severely or seized their property. The barons demanded that King John obey the law. When he refused, they captured London and John was forced to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede in June 1215. The result of the negotiations was written down by the king's clerks into the document we know as Magna Carta. And although Magna Carta was intended to create peace between King John and his rebellious barons, England was plunged into civil war after the Pope declared the charter invalid.
Yes, you heard that correctly. The Pope opposed the Magna Carta and it threw the whole country into civil war.
People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights.
The origins of natural law and natural rights predate Christianity. Who's to say that Christ wasn't influenced by these philosophies and not the other way around?
The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree.
Just as with the brutal Empire of Rome that Tom does not relate to, the Christian Western British Empire unjustly ruled over many of its territories. So much so that it took a non-Christian Indian man to begin a human rights movement in their territory. It's clear that the human rights story of the world is not as linear as Christians often want to make it. Many Christian apologists will claim that universal human values weren't necessarily founded by Christianity, but just propagated by it. This rationale just proves that there's nothing fundamental to Christianity that makes these values meaningful. Rather, just that Christianity is a good medium of cultural transfer. This may be so, but it doesn't mean that this is necessarily the best way to pass on our values.
Even if I agreed with it, it wouldn't make the case I think you want to make, because it would be an instance of what's called the genetic fallacy, which is even if we granted that our respect for individual rights, say, came from a Judeo-Christian tradition, it doesn't mean that it can only come from there, or that it even is best gotten from there. And I would say that it actually hasn't come principally from there. And
the apologetic value for a claim like Christianity made the West only has weight if it can show that it necessitates Christianity. If it doesn't, then we should be searching for new ways to propagate and improve this moral framework. As an atheist, I see the moral progress of our culture, call it Western or Christian, as a sign not that we're getting closer to the teachings 2,000 years ago, but rather that we're learning and refining moral wisdom from any and all sources. I've heard this claim that Christianity made the West way too many times. It's time that secularism learned how to sell itself. Secularism is often blamed for the evils of people like Stalin and Hitler, but never given credit for the good aspects, such as values that are directly at odds with biblical teachings, such as freedom of speech, democracy, liberty, and the value of all human life. Thank God we don't follow his moral code, but rather we follow the moral wisdom of thinkers throughout time like Aristotle, Kant, Newton, Jefferson, and even Jesus. Men and women who have thought through these hard problems and have given us insight into the moral nature of humans and tools that help us deal with these complex moral problems that we still see on a daily basis. Okay, we're almost to the end of the video, and I promised you guys a juicy secret. Thoughtful Faith is actually my brother Jacob's channel. You guys should go check him out. He makes great content, and I look forward to the friendly family fights to come. That's all I've got. I'm Forrest, Latter-day Skeptic. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.